Hello, my name is Michael Dewan Herrick. Welcome to this 34th episode in my series titled Questioning Woke Psychotherapy. Today I'm joined in conversation with Nick Oprychal. Hello, Nick. Welcome.
Hello, Michael. Very good attempt at pronouncing my surname.
Did I
It's
get it okay?
the closest yet.
Okay, well, I
So,
worked on it. I worked on
I appreciate it.
it. So a little bit that you shared about your background. I know that you're a psychotherapist in private practice in the UK. You're also in the final year of a doctoral program, and I didn't get where it is you're studying or your thesis or the area of study, if you could briefly mention
Yeah,
that.
sure. It's with Canterbury Christchurch University. It's under Les Lancaster, who's very well known in transpersonal psychology. He's
Mm,
my primary supervisor. Val Thomas, who you've probably talked to, who
yeah.
is my secondary supervisor. And the project is looking at the impact of culture wars on psychotherapy in general, but
Hmm.
transpersonal psychotherapy in particular. And I look at the impact of the kind of woke left liberal side
Hmm.
and the populist right. My thesis is that these are interlinked and feed off of each other, and I'm sure that we'll probably talk about that as we go through the
Okay.
interview.
Okay, great. When that you've already shared what I had written down to share about
Uh-huh.
the culture wars and modern left identity politics and national populism,
Yeah.
and transpersonal psychology. You also have an interest in eco psychology, I understand.
That's right. It's mainly because I live on a small holding in the middle of nowhere. So eco psychology is kind of unavoidable to me because it's so obvious if it's the kind of middle of winter and the things are getting dark at 3 o'clock. There's
Hmm.
no street lights, so you get gloomy pretty quickly. And similarly, when spring starts, you're
Right,
lifted in a very obvious way. So this
right.
is kind of mainly through the pressure of living out here that this interest came to be for me.
Sure, I understand. Also, you've written a chapter in this book,
That's right.
Cynical Therapies. It's titled Psychotherapy, Ideology, and the New Aristocracy.
That's
And yeah,
Yeah, that's right. And I would say that the kind of what I wanted to talk to you about today builds off of that.
okay,
I
excellent.
used the image in there of uh, Jeff Bezos wearing a Che Guevara t-shirt,
Yeah, I
and
remember that. Yeah.
this is kind of a central image to me in a way. If you don't mind me expanding a bit, that uh, essentially, the main critique that I hear of the woke, if we call it that, is that
Hmm.
they popularly are kind of conceived of as Marxist, postmodern, and extraneous to the Western tradition. And
Hmm.
my view is they're not meaningfully Marxist, they're barely meaningfully postmodern, and they're internal to the Western tradition. My sense is actually wokeness itself is a change in the neoliberal ideology that is the center of kind of the West at the moment. And
Okay.
what I mean by that is say in the 1990s,
Hmm.
neoliberalism, it was kind of aligned with a uh, at least surface level adherence to Western values. They were in the middle of the Cold War. And so, if you listen to a speech by Reagan or Thatcher or something like that, they were still drawing on these kind of Western cultural artifacts. Like Reagan
Okay.
talks about like Christ or he talks about Moses in his speeches and things like
Hmm.
this. So there was this kind of like neoliberal economic system,
Hmm.
but the ideology on top was still very much West is best, if you get what I mean.
Okay.
And
Do you think that that's still true? The West is best? I mean,
no, this is kind of what I'm coming to, is that what I think has happened now is that that kind of neoliberal economic system has attached itself to the deconstructive kind of lefty mode of the post 1960s left. So what it was before was you had the economic and cultural right. So they had the kind of the Western chauvinism, or call it chauvin, the West is best view,
mhm.
with the economic deconstruction of neoliberalism, and
Okay.
that was opposed to the old left, which was cultural deconstruction, but
Uh-huh.
then it had this kind of protective aspect when it came to economic disruption. So it would be
Right.
people before profit, or
Right.
protecting
Uh-huh.
cultures from the damage of the neoliberal
Mhm.
system. And now, so you had on the left this protective side when it came to economics, deconstructive side when it came to culture. On the right, you had a deconstructive kind of capitalism in neoliberalism, and on the cultural side, a kind of a protection of Western values.
I see. I see.
And
I
now
see.
what's happened is the deconstructive side of the economics of the old right have merged with the deconstructive cultural aspects of the left, and we end up with this thing that both seeks to disrupt through culture and disrupt in terms of just letting neoliberal capitalism privatize every aspect of our day-to-day lives.
I see.
So I think that's why now we see this woke downplaying of class politics, for instance, that cultural politics have
Right.
become so prevalent in
Well,
its
yeah,
stead.
this is fascinating, and I may be out of my depth here, but from some of the reading I've done, I've gotten the idea that some believe that Marxism failed as an economic critique, and it decided, some decided that they would choose identities uh, to focus on. But it's the same fundamental arrangement of the oppressed and the oppressor. But because uh, there wasn't a lot of momentum forward in getting an economic version of Marxism going, it was rebranded as cultural Marxism. And I wonder what you think of that. Because I've heard both arguments, that it's really not Marxism at all, and cultural Marxism really isn't a thing. But there does seem to be something similar there,
I think rhetorically they draw on this oppressor oppressed kind of dynamic, and they want to see themselves as revolutionaries.
Hmm.
So I'm currently doing a discourse analysis of the way in which therapeutic institutions present themselves. And there are these big mainstream institutions, say like the BPS, the APA, UKCP, ACP, and
Hmm.
in their official documents, the ones that I'm analyzing anyway, they present themselves as rebel and institution at the same time. They feign as if they are revolutionaries, whilst they very much are at the top of the heap and kind of dictating the shape of the
Right.
society that we're in.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
Uh-huh.
the thing that I think gets mixed up with people is wokeness. It rests upon a theory called standpoint epistemology. Standpoint epistemology is a way of perceiving the world in which there is this idea that the uh, the most marginal have the most valid uh, viewpoint on society,
Hmm.
and that these marginal people will reshape society through the power of their critique, and this critique will come in and basically like reconfigure the dominant system that we have. So this is
Uh-huh.
where this kind of idea of we live in a system of white supremacy, and say like the black trans disabled person who is the most marginalized is the most important, because their viewpoint is seen to be this transformative
Uh-huh.
thing that can change everything.
Right. One of
And
the,
that's
okay, go ahead.
sorry, that sounds Marxist at first glance, but if you look at what the outcome of that is, ultimately, the outcome of applying standpoint epistemology, it is just that minorities also get to participate in the kind of liberal exchange market uh, in the same way that, say, a white straight man would. That's
Okay.
as radical as it gets. It's not the same as Marxism, where there's going to be an overthrow
Uh-huh.
of the entirety of the kind of structure of society.
Okay. And you don't believe that the trajectory of this argument is going anywhere else, that this is something that can be indefinitely sustained? Because when I read stuff on decolonization and, whiteness studies, and there's a pretty fierce attack on every value and norm of Western society. And so where is that going to go? Is that just going to kind of peter out when? And so that's one question. The other is, do you think that there should be something bigger and better that happens rather than allowing everybody equal access to an economic system?
Well,
Um,
I think so. Those two questions. So the first one, what I would say is, I think a lot of this is bluster. And the reason why I say this is, again, I'm looking through my research at the way that the institutions that adopt this ideology, at the way they function. When they actually get into power, what do they do? Do they deconstruct? Suddenly they've given up all norms. They've given up, for instance, the BPS or UKCP. They adopt this ideology. Do they then say, oh, okay, so all the criteria which we use to evaluate therapists are criteria of white supremacy. We're going to give that all up now. We're going to make it, just kind of come and be relativistic about your values. No, they don't. What they do is they basically do the exact same thing that they've said before, with a few words like sustainability and inclusivity thrown
uh,
in. So I think it is a bit of a red herring.
mhm.
But there's this kind of panic that, like I say, the rhetoric gives you the impression like the revolution is coming.
Okay.
The entire system is going to be overthrown. Then
Okay.
the rhetoric of the anti-woke response also becomes this kind of catastrophic. The revolution is coming. The revolution has already happened, mate. They're already in there.
Okay.
Nothing is really that much changed.
So,
Sorry to say.
all right, okay. If that's true,
Yeah.
what's the problem? If nothing's, I mean, what do you think then needs to change?
Well,
If we're already there and they've taken
yeah.
over, why should we be concerned about their impact on psychotherapy?
Well, I think because what is happening is that, again, this is kind of becoming uh, an a way of maintaining a neoliberal system in quite an extreme form, where criticism is not allowed. So populist criticism is not allowed. Uh, Religious perspectives are not allowed. It is an ideological system that prevents people from questioning and prevents people from moving outside of a certain boundary. But what I'm saying is, it's not revolutionary. I'll throw something in that will probably both piss you off and get you thinking, but I
Okay,
actually think that this is
great.
conservative. And what I mean
Oh
by
yeah.
conservative is not that it is traditional conservatism where it has a kind of like a Judeo-Christian moral system or something like that. I mean, it actually conserves the position that we find ourselves
Absolutely,
in,
absolutely.
you know?
No, and that doesn't piss me off. I agree
Okay,
with.
good, good, good.
I totally agree with you.
Yeah,
And there was I heard you talk about this with Jocko and Christine in your
yeah,
podcast with them, and I think you also mentioned it in your chapter. You make a distinction between the word critical and ideological, and you
yeah,
point out that it's been kind of taken on by critical social justice, but it doesn't mean what we think it means. It doesn't mean what it's supposed to mean.
yeah,
It's a closed hermeneutic system where you can only ask certain questions and you can only talk about certain things. So it's extremely conservative, really. I mean,
yeah, yeah.
to its own ideology.
That's exactly it. So
Yeah.
uh, I'm not saying that it's not a danger or that it's not restrictive or that it's not going to cause some damage. But what I'm saying is that I don't believe it, like, I believe it to be conserving a system already in place rather than pushing revolution. The
Uh,
ideology might get stronger,
uh,
so it might become more and more difficult to criticize.
right.
And I think the byproduct of this, or the byproduct of this, we can see the byproduct of this is this emergent populist right,
Okay. All right.
which is the stuff, it kind of consists of the stuff that is being excluded through the application of this ideology.
Mhm.
So, it's becoming focused on white men, conservatives. Slowly, it kind of gathers more people to it. So, black conservatives or white women who oppose the trans movement or something like this, or Christians.
Mhm.
It's kind of
Uh,
slowly gaining more and more people because the kind of neoliberal ideology is becoming more and more exclusionary.
right.
You
And
know,
when we use the word populism, national
yeah,
populism or ethnic populism, it's a demonized group. I mean,
yeah. I don't see it in
if
that
you
way.
object, then you're automatically moved way over to the far right, and
Yeah,
you're. I hear that you recognize the far right. You recognize that there's a kind of a reactionary
yeah,
position that isn't very helpful, but that there's something within populism that is attempting to preserve some values that just might be worthwhile.
absolutely. This is going back to what I was saying about the. I think that what we have now is the deconstructive cultural kind of impulse of the post 60s left and the disruption caused by the neoliberal right, that
Hmm.
these two things combined, they are changing society at a great speed.
Hmm.
And my sense of the populists is they're mainly people who are being left behind as a result of these changes.
Right. And
That
some of those are what are poor white people, right?
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And
Uh-huh.
again, if you read the documents that are being put out by these institutions, like these therapeutic uh, big collective institutions, they emphasize change. We need change. We need to speak up for more change. Everything is about change, 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 change. And there is absolutely no consideration of the idea that change might lead to, excuse me, my Roomba has gone off as we speak.
Well, maybe we'll keep this in
One for the edit.
for comic effect, or maybe I'll edit it
Yeah,
out.
I think. because I started talking about change, probably a message from Amazon, but uh, there's no consideration that change is just kind of moving pieces around, and there's going to be people who lose out. It again is this neoliberal
Uh-huh.
viewpoint that change and growth is available with no downside ever. We can just keep growing. We can keep changing. Everything progresses. Progress, progress, progress. Things get better and better and better. And the people who suffer through this are more and more exercised to the margins.
Uh-huh.
And on the margins, they find populism,
Sure.
because this is kind of waiting. And I have a critique of populism as well, that it is also a resentment based ideology
Uh-huh.
to a large degree.
Sure.
you know it
Mm.
But we can go into that,
Right,
or
right, right. Okay. I'm thinking of the phrase "the long march through the institution." So when you say,
mm,
the revolution has already happened, it's not one to come.
yeah,
It's a kind of a sealed ideological system which keeps things the way they are. But we got here somehow.
mm,
And do you see that this was a process over decades of entering into academia, entering into university systems, and then moving out from there into culture generally through corporations and DEI trainings and so forth? That this is there was a point at which something happened
yeah,
that cemented this ideology and gave it such great power, while it cries about its lack of power and all the power that is suppressing it.
yeah. Well, I think something did happen, but I have a different take on it than a lot of people, where uh, I often hear this idea that the postmodernists, kind of like Yves Foucault and his assorted friends, were able to uh, brainwash the entirety of the Western world through some barely comprehensible books, and that was the kind of key that made everybody forget why the West is in any way worthwhile. And I don't think that's the case. I think the reason why these trends became very popular in academia at the time they did was because the world that they were currently in, which was changing towards this kind of commodification and globalism, uh, was a world which these ideas suited. So there was a fertile ground which made these theories seem more applicable than the ones that they succeeded. And I think if you read a lot of the old postmodernists, so Baudrillard, Foucault especially, uh, I and Deleuze, Guattari, people like this, you you do not find a kind of idea of a teleology like you get in the woke systems, where there's this kind of desire to push forwards and realize a brave new world. Uh, what you
Right.
get is a kind of sense that there is no way forward. There is no correct way forward. We've kind of reached a point at which teleology doesn't make sense anymore. Teleology meaning the kind of drive towards realizing,
Utopian
exactly
final
utopian
place.
goal.
So
And
these are the early writers.
yeah, yeah,
It's hard to get my head around. I mean, I hear that Foucault perhaps would not be on board with all of what's going on with gender politics
no,
these days, but it does seem that the critical social justice movement has borrowed from or used postmodern thought, maybe in an extreme form, to put forward some of its ideas. Somebody, for
well,
instance, like Judith Butler, you know,
yeah,
uh,
yeah.
that it
I,
gives a kind of apparently lofty intellectual justification or explanation for its teleological project.
Yeah. Like I'm not an expert on Butler. I can only I think, comment on the different theorists that I'm familiar with. But
Hmm.
again, so I will referring them back because, Jordan Peterson and what's his name, critical James Lindsay.
James Lindsay.
These guys, they highlight Foucault as a particular influence on critical social justice. But if you actually go and read his work, he uses firstly, he actually wrote his work as a counterpoint to
Right.
the dominant Marxism. So
Sure.
the dominant Marxist view was that you had this kind of utopian world that could be realized.
Right.
And his work was explicitly written against this. He was saying there is no historical direction that's a liberal construction,
Hmm.
and that power, like if you think about the woke idea of power, it starts at the top, straight white people, and then it kind of decreases, or it's kind of imposed down on the rest of the population. And his idea was, power is multifaceted. So if I was in say, a discussion with you, or we were in a therapy group, and you said something, and I started saying, I am as a Polish person, I am wounded by this, and you haven't recognized my Slavic uh, background. Foucault would say that is me applying power, that power is not this unidirectional thing. It kind of comes in all different ways, and it's not even oppressive. It's the only way that you can create a
Right.
sense of subjectivity, you
Okay.
know. So I think a lot of these
I
readings are really off.
Okay. Well, I hear you. And, there's a lot to study, a lot to try to understand. What seems true to me right now is that what you're saying is true. And yet, just because Foucault said things the way he said them, and we shouldn't draw conclusions from that that are wrong, he gets referred to by those who
It does.
do appear to misconstrue what he had to say. I
Yeah.
also want to say that I'm not generally antagonistic to postmodern thought. I think it
Yeah.
was a tremendous contribution to our understanding of ourselves, and
Yeah.
it helps us unpack our presumptions and look at power relationships. So I think that's really useful. What I think is wrong is when it's taken to its extremes, and the idea of there being no kind of substrate of objective reality at
Mm,
all as a reference point for orienting ourselves.
mm.
That's where I think it goes too far. But it
Yeah.
was a great contribution intellectually to our understanding of ourselves.
Well, see, I would agree with you, and I am not a relativist myself. In terms of the way in which these theories have been taken,
Hmm.
uh, this is mainly through intersectionality, that the intersectionalists, Kimberly Crenshaw
Right.
and Patricia Hill Collins, they took this uh, idea of different forms of power working alongside each other and different subjectivities working alongside each other, but they made it into this kind of top-down framework
Hmm.
where they, again, having standpoint epistemology and Foucault don't go together. They're kind of like opposed theoretically,
Right.
you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, and lots of contradictions like that
Yeah, yeah.
within the critical social justice ideology. One of the things that I've observed about standpoint epistemology and this idea of lived experience is that there's a
Mm,
kind of a logical fallacy that gets perpetrated, and that's that because I have this identity and because I have this set of experiences which illustrate some kind of oppressive force, therefore my experience can be generalized to my entire identity group. And,
Mhm.
and rather than taking a more scientific approach to look at how many people in how many situations experience this, and does that make a general statement about the nature of culture and society? That's a
Yeah, yeah.
but to just take a handful of people who report a certain experience and then to generalize it seems
Well,
false.
well then, just to bring it back just once more to Foucault, you remember this was a guy that he refused to call himself gay.
Yeah, yeah,
He
yeah.
refused to identify as a gay man. And the reason he did that was because he said, as soon as I put myself in that category, I'm applying that discourse of what a gay man is to myself, which
Uh,
again is totally opposed to what you would say the intersectional
right.
viewpoint is. So I
So,
think there's big
yeah.
disjuncts there.
So that implies something about Foucault, but I don't know that it's true. That his view of individuals is that they can't be reduced to identity categories, that each person has a kind of a unique set of realities and experiences that they need to be understood as individuals and not by categories and labels.
It's well with him, he didn't. He thought individual was one of those categories and labels, so it makes it a bit tricky. But what it
Okay,
is like
okay.
there's all these competing kind of cult, almost like the collective unconscious uh, is competing. Parts of the collective unconscious are constantly kind of competing for being front and center of the person's subjectivity.
Okay.
And so there's these different ways that you can move in and out of a particular discourse, a construct of a person, but you don't have to stay as one. You don't have to say, I am a gay man
Uh-huh,
or I am a
uh-huh.
white man or whatever, and it's very opposite now where it's kind of like you sediment yourself.
Right, it's very essentialist.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I wonder if we could turn a corner because there's a
Sure.
couple other topics that I hope we can get to. One is that I wonder if we can bring our conversation to the ground in terms of psychotherapy and the implications for all of this for the actual practice of
Yeah.
psychotherapy. A therapist sitting in a room with a client. How do you think that critical social justice influences that relationship and what actually transpires? Uh,
Well, yeah, I mean,
and is that
my
problematic? Is that problematic in some way?
Yeah, it absolutely is problematic because I think what's happening is that therapy is being moved into a position of an ideological imprinting service, which I've said to Jacka and Christine previously.
Yeah, I heard you
Um,
say if that's what you want to do, then broadcast
exactly,
that.
go
Say
for it.
I'm 60 pounds and I'll imprint you ideologically.
Yeah, this is absolutely fine. I would have no problem with that because there would be no surreptitious kind of confusion of roles, but
Right,
it is being confused as health, as mental health, and
right.
so I. It's interesting. I've been reading a lot of different authors around these kind of questions, and there is an idea that I've been picking up from people like Christopher Lasch and the paleoconservative Paul Gottfried, which the idea of something called the therapeutic state, which is this idea that when you have a kind of pluralist liberalism, therapy becomes the substitute for morality. So you're kind of there's this kind of blurring between religious morality and therapeutic practice. And
Where
I
the therapist becomes some kind of moral authority.
Yeah. And
Okay.
kind of the therapeutic enterprise becomes almost like a moral enterprise. And I wonder if this is happening. Uh,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
I
Okay,
think,
so that would what that would look like then would be a therapist, as you say, indoctrinating an ideology, which would
yeah,
be declaring this is true, you have this identity, you're either oppressed or you're an oppressor, and so you're either a virtuous victim or you're a kind of a complicit oppressor,
yeah,
and this is now what we need to focus on. Either you uh,
yeah,
becoming, I don't even know if you'd say empowered if you're a victim, but making your grievances, and if you're an oppressor, then your job, what we need to do in therapy is to provide a confessional space for you. Uh,
yeah.
and that's in contrast to the roots of therapy, which I think are attempting to be neutral, attempting to not be morally indoctrinating, and attempting to provide a space for people to sort out their own morality and
Mm.
address the problems that they actually bring to therapy, not the ones that the therapist decides that they should address.
Yeah. And there is in my literature review of the social justice kind of material before all the BLM stuff happened, there was already this push to institutionalizing a particular political framework, and I think it's become far more prevalent since all of the.
Okay. What kind of concrete things have you read that are being mandated or suggested that therapists do? Is it that therapists should try to educate a person about the system that's oppressing them? Is it that a therapist should try to inform a white heterosexual male that he is, an oppressor? I mean, are there kind of concrete instructions for how to bring that into therapy?
Well, the thing, yeah, in some papers that I've read, there are concrete instructions. So in some, there are concrete instructions to you to bring in, say, for instance, the kind of American context of white and black relations. Excuse me.
Mhm.
Even if there's no relevance to the client themselves. And this is suggestions that I've kind of been reading in papers that have been published in about
Uh-huh.
2019 before all this stuff kicked
Uh-huh.
off. In recent, again, looking at the materials that are kind of coming out of the UKCP, BACP, I did an interesting analysis just the other day where it was a article saying how to have open conversations about race and racism.
Mhm,
And,
mhm.
and this was the title of the article, but the entire article was different speech taboos about, uh, we
An
need to
open
have an
conversation.
open discussion, but not an open discussion where you say, for instance, have a color blindness. If someone professes color blindness, you should know that it's a kind of a way in which the conversation will be stopped because there's no getting through to somebody who
Yeah,
adheres to these views. And it was all stuff like this.
yeah, yeah. Are you
Along.
you're familiar with Coleman Hughes?
Mhm.
He's put out a book.
Yes, I am.
He's given a lot of thought to this color blindness.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I've heard and read is that if you're a white person working with a person of color or a black person, one of the things you're supposed to say is to acknowledge your whiteness and your privilege and
Yeah.
inquire as to how the client, being black, feels about that,
Yeah.
and explore that.
I've actually experienced, it's funny, the first session I ever had with a therapist, uh, it was a black therapist. I worked with him for just a couple of years. Literally, the first thing he said to me going into the therapy room, this is my first session of therapy ever. How do you feel working with a black therapist? That was
Okay.
the first words of the first therapy session that
All
I
right.
ever had. And
All right. How was that? What was that like to hear that, and how did you respond?
I think it was confusing for me.
Okay.
Uh, it was confusing for me why that was being asked immediately
Uh-huh.
of me, why that was the context
Uh-huh.
for our first words together.
Right.
But
What I
you know,
I
oh,
if I haven't had that experience, what I imagine would cross my mind if I was asked that question in an initial session is, does he believe or assume that I'm a racist who somehow is going to doubt his qualifications
yeah,
or his
yeah,
ability to be helpful to me?
yeah,
And you know,
yeah. I think that's the implication in
you
some way.
know, I because I'd heard this so many times and it just intuitively didn't seem right, I resisted ever asking it. But then I did ask it on a few occasions of black clients, and I got puzzled looks, like,
Mm.
why are, in a sense, why are you asking that? Like, and generally it was, I hadn't thought about it, and it doesn't matter.
Well, look, I mean, if the context, uh,
Well, yeah,
if the
there are
context
times
felt
I
important,
would, yeah,
yeah, yeah,
if there's a reason to ask it, I certainly
yeah,
would. And I have asked it in those contexts, some kind of conversation did happen,
yeah,
and it seemed appropriate. So I'm not saying it's never it's never the
yeah,
thing,
yeah, yeah.
but it seems to be an immediate kind of damage to the budding relationship to come out with that too
W-
early.
Well, I mean, would you mind if I kind of brought in some stuff about the modality that I work in, the transpersonal
Yeah, maybe this is a
modality?
good segue to that. I'm curious about how you practice that, but also its relevance to culture wars and identity politics and all of that as well. So yeah, let's go for it.
Yeah, for me, it's quite central because the identitarian kind of frame that I see growing more and more popular is at root, it's materialist. And what I mean by that is that it says that the most foundational thing about your subjectivity is what color skin you have, what country you were born in, what sexual organs you have. That is the thing that then defines everything else. And there's
Mhm.
this phrase that in a book by Kimberly Crenshaw, where I don't know if it's her that used it herself or one of the authors who are also in the book, but it's um, white. How does it go? It goes, the universal is whiteness raised to the level of an absolute. So the universal is whiteness raised to the level of an absolute, meaning that there can not be any kind of route to subjectivity, route to being a person that is shared across human beings.
And if we assert that there is, then that's some kind of white supremacist talk.
Exactly, that's a form of
Uh-huh.
racism.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, sorry, Michael, go on.
Well, I just went, my background is I went to Naropa University. It's a Buddhist informed education, and I spent many years practicing and studying Buddhism. And the sense of identity, I mean, the transpersonal really, it's in the name, transpersonal.
Yeah,
Personal
yeah, yeah, yeah,
is, our ego, and our ego is made of all of these conditional identities, our
yeah,
sex organs, our color of our skin, maybe the group we belong to, all
yeah,
these things. But the transpersonal is beyond that. And
Yeah,
it's something we can explore intellectually, but I find that most people who have a keen interest that actually have an experience of the transpersonal,
yeah,
of not being identified with all of these material things. And
yeah.
that's transformative, And the other thing about it is it's pretty self-evident with that experience. Some may say this is a leap, but there's a self-evident truth that it's universal, that this is everybody's fundamental identity. It's a field of consciousness, that's free of all these conditions,
Absolutely. And
Yeah,
and therefore you can't have these two frameworks, these two ontological frameworks going running at the same time. It's like two contradicting computer
right,
programs trying to run
right,
simultaneously.
right, right.
And uh,
Well,
so go on.
Well, I'm informed a lot by an author, Ken Wilber, who promotes
Yeah, yeah,
something
yeah,
called integral theory. And a basic premise in that is the idea of transcending and including. So
yeah.
I would say, on one level, these two things seem to contradict each other, but I think that there's a level of integration that we can get to where we can access the transpersonal while we also recognize the conditional or the personal.
See, absolutely. I
Yeah,
totally agree with that.
yeah,
But then you have to kind of define that as your your kind of epistemology. Whereas if you're saying like the intersectionalists and again, like I think neoliberalism leads to materialism is the foundation for everything, that I don't think you can really make space for that transpersonal viewpoint
right,
without
right.
kind of destroying the foundation of the system that you're kind of resting on. And
Yeah, yeah,
what I see with a lot of people who uh, work with this kind of intersectionality is they don't delve deep enough into the system that they're employing to actually realize the contradictions,
right.
you know.
Hmm.
But I would be much more along
Hmm.
that kind of Wilberian line.
Yeah. Well, I suppose something has to happen to open that window or deliver that experience of the transpersonal,
Mm,
whether it's
mm,
a life-changing event or some kind of awe in the face of nature, or whether it's
mm,
some kind of psychedelic substance that opens it, or whether it's a meditation. I think until that experience dawns, it's really hard to get out of that
mm,
trap of identification with all of the material reality.
mm, mm.
Hmm. Can can you say something about how this actually is practiced? In therapy. You're working with people. This is your orientation. Does it inform the kind of questions you ask, the kind of comments you make, the way that you guide people in dealing with the issues that they're bringing to you?
It is a that's quite a big question.
Yeah,
I I think
I
because
understand.
yeah, because so much is based on the relationship in the here and now. I don't tend to be too formulaic, but I think it is avoiding what we were talking about earlier, prescribed roles, prescribed relationship
Mhm.
patterns. So again, you are a white man, I am a white man, assuming that now we're going to have our particular white man experience, and then I'm a Polish white man, and I don't know your
I'm
origin, but
American.
yeah, that we're going to have like a kind of massive difference, and that we're going to have to negotiate it in this oppressor oppressed way.
Right.
This kind of formalism,
Uh,
formalizing of relationship is to me antithetical to the way that I practice.
Uh,
My main way of practicing is to try and almost move through and round these formulations and get us to a point where it's just me and you, and we're kind of meeting without any of these formulations in the way. And that can be for a brief second. And it can
uh,
be very anxiety provoking for
mhm,
many people. Many
uh,
people will immediately try and pull in
right,
a formulation.
right,
But
right.
but that to me is the transpersonal, where there is this kind of void of unscripted relationship
Hmm.
between me and the other person.
Right,
And I'm not trying to fill that with you're white, you're a woman, you're
right,
homosexual, whatever. Does this
right.
make sense?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm thinking another aspect of the transpersonal is not only getting beyond more limited identifications, but it's a sense of connectedness to
Yeah.
other and to the world and to nature and to humanity. And I'm currently finally reading Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff's book, The Cuddling of the American Mind, and they make the
Mhm.
distinction between the common humanity approach and the common enemy approach. And
Mhm.
it seems that what you're describing is finding the common humanity with your
Mhm.
clients
Mhm.
rather than helping to identify who the common enemies
The
might be.
other.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Mm. And
yeah,
it's funny because they, like a lot of these social justice perspectives talk about otherness quite often, but what I see them doing is trying to codify relationships to the other. They're trying to formally codify
absolutely.
how others relate to each other.
Right.
And again, to me, this is kind of the opposite of the transpersonal
Hmm.
impulse, which
Yeah,
is to
yeah,
kind of decodify and this is kind of where as well I like the postmodernists, because I think they're useful to pick
yeah,
these things apart,
yeah.
you know.
Well, maybe this is a good segue to something else that I hoped we would talk a little bit
Mm,
about, and that's othering. And something that we of the so-called non-woke might be careful about is
mm,
othering the woke. And
yeah.
I interviewed Jaco also for my channel, and he talked about a psychoanalytic view, which includes object relations. He talked about Melanie Klein and splitting, and the idea of the all good, the all bad, and
Mm,
that it does seem that critical social justice tends to do a lot of splitting in this regard, create
yeah,
the other that's all bad and the other that's all good. And we might be careful as
yeah,
so-called non-woke not to fall into that and not to otherize the woke as all bad, you know.
yeah. And you can see this splitting going on all of the time. I mean, I could say there is this kind of parallel identity forming where you think woke is kind of the second coming of communism. You you believe that Jordan Peterson, James Lindsay, and Matt Goodwin are the three best academics in the entire world. You think climate change is a hoax, COVID vaccinations are a hoax, and you watch GB News trigonometry unheard and spiked. Okay, and if all of these
And you
are
listen to Chris
accurate,
Rufo. Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah, okay.
if all of these are kind of accurate, uh, I think there's this kind of oppositional identity is forming as a counterpart to the woke
Uh,
form. Does that
right.
make sense?
No, it does. And it's interesting, so that's something to be careful of. All of these
Yeah,
people also maybe also contributing some truths worth hearing,
yeah,
but if we form an identity as an opposition to the other of woke, maybe
yeah.
we're going down the wrong path. The three
Well,
tensions that I've set for my channel, one is to
yeah.
offer a critique of woke. The other is to recognize and preserve its good intentions and any useful ideas it has. And to third intention is to see about offering an alternative.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Do you mind if I stay, like, because
Go ahead, whatever. Yeah.
I think that this uh, woke and oppositional kind of like anti-woke,
Uh-huh.
there is a way in which we have the danger of falling into just a kind of consumerism. And what I mean by consumerism is a lot of these kind of uh, discourses that are coming out of the anti-woke side are starting to feel to me like they don't have very much actual informational content in them. They are starting to feel like there's a kind of rehashing of the known, and people kind of can be drawn, especially by algorithm, to just kind of consume their own anger in the
Uh-huh.
form of like a discourse about how, you know, this is happening in schools and this is happening in academia, and there's kind of a consumption without the desire to move past it.
Okay.
It becomes a stuck Kleinian split position
Hmm.
where all you're doing is kind of consuming your own bile, and there is no desire to kind of maybe talk to somebody and change their mind, or listen to somebody who's different from these kind of very narrow um, windows and change your mind,
Okay.
you know.
So is that your proposal or suggestion, is that instead of forming an oppositional group and simply consuming our own bile, that we ought to try to have conversations in which
Abs-
we're open to changing our minds, or perhaps seeing if we can persuade somebody else?
Absolutely. I think you have to not, or I think there's an importance that we don't end up going into the same framework that the woke are using and just kind of parading victimhood. Or, you know, I'm so oppressed because I am a this, I am so oppressed because I am a that. It works the other way around as well. If you,
Right.
you know, want to kind of parade how bad it is for you
Right.
because you're a white male or straight or
Right.
whatever,
Hmm.
I understand that.
Hmm.
Yeah. But you're not going to get any movement from that because you're engaging in the same, you're engaging in the terms that the woke are setting.
Right.
It gets
Right.
reduced again to
Creating
materialism.
creating creating your own grievance culture. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
materialistic again. It's
okay.
identitarian again.
Yeah.
You know.
So I'm curious if you've had an experience that I have. So I agree with what you're saying, and I've attempted this. I have found it very difficult to have those conversations, those reciprocal,
Mm.
good faith conversations, that sometimes people seem so ideologically captured that it's not possible.
I
You know,
Yeah, I think that it is very much the case. But you know, I mean, I was even watching. There was like an interview between Owen Jones and Peter Hitchens that I was watching the other day, and I'm thinking if these two can have a conversation, then surely, you know, we can
right.
have at least a start.
Right. Well, I'll tell you, earlier today, I was reading The Coddling of the American Mind, and uh, uh, what was presented was there was a Trump rally in which a bunch of protesters came, and they were shouting down and calling names and trying to disrupt the speakers of the Trump rally. And then one of the leaders of the Trump rally invited somebody from the protesting group to come up on stage and gave
Mm.
them 2 minutes to make their statement. And they started talking, and there were moments when they were applauded by the Trump crowd. And then
Mm.
when the Trump crowd was kind of shouting them down. But in the end, there was some kind of conversation that
Yeah.
happened. I'll be honest, it actually brought tears to my eyes to think that
Mm,
was even possible.
mm, mm, mm. I
So
think,
yeah.
yeah, that this is partly an artifact of the internet. And again, to go on about algorithms, you get shot down a particular rabbit hole, a
Hmm.
particular
Hmm.
algorithmic wormhole in which, again, you're fed very narrow bandwidth.
Hmm.
Uh, and I think that the issue with that is that people encounter the other in terms of other politics, other perspectives, far less. And so there's this kind of fragility that develops. And also, people do get these images of who the woke are, who the anti-woke, the populists are, uh, reinforced and fed back to them again by these kind of algorithmic
Hmm.
forces.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I think, go and speak to some people in person. For fuck's sake, turn off the internet and get off whatever social
Hmm.
media platform
Hmm.
you're consuming, and go and talk to the other side in person.
Whenever possible, I agree.
Mm,
Um, at the same time, and I don't know if this is because I've been sucked down some rabbit hole myself. Um, my sense is that any disagreement, any dissent, any unacceptable question will quickly label me or brand me as some kind of far right populist
mhm.
extremist, and the way forward is extremely difficult when that happens.
Yeah, yeah. Like, again, I don't think it's going to work with everyone.
Yeah.
Uh, like recently, I'm pretty much an anti-communist, partly through my heritage and experiences of
Uh-huh.
crossing Berlin Wall and things like this.
Yes, yes.
But at the same time, I've been listening to a load of Marxists that I'm finding very interesting lately. I don't
Uh-huh.
agree with their positions, but these people are not all kind of gibbering lunatics.
Uh-huh.
There's a lot of value that I
Uh-huh.
think can be found in these positions. And sometimes I go and listen to people who are way further on the right than me
Hmm.
as well, like Paul Gottfried, I mentioned earlier, like
Hmm.
kind of paleo-conservative. And I think if you can't do this, then you're going to be slowly sucked more and more into this kind of opposition or dogmatism.
Right.
You need to challenge yourself.
Sure, sure. And again, this is where the transpersonal view and experience
Mm,
probably is extremely valuable, because rather than being entrenched in some kind of a positional identity, you're more
exactly.
rooted in common humanity. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Because otherwise, how can you move out of the ideology? If you think the ideology, the material uh, role that you've been given, is the only thing that matters, then any alternative to that is going to feel like an existential threat.
Right.
You know, it's
Right.
only by having some kind of transcendent aspect of the self that you can even conceive of moving out of that identity or encountering something oppositional to that identity and not feeling like you're going to be murdered.
Well said. I agree.
You know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, is there anything else that you'd like to talk about? I think, our
Hmm.
time may be limited at this point.
Yeah, don't tempt me, Michael.
Plenty more that you could. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, is there anything that I wanted to talk about?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I think we covered most of what I was interested in. One of the things that we didn't talk about was the pathologizing of dissent, which you
Mhm.
talk about. Everything is a phobia,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
is overlaps with psychotherapy. I think there's both the pathology of the non-woke,
Mm.
but there's also the kind of fragile mental health
Mm.
of those who might be offended by wrong words or wrong thoughts. There's a kind
Mm.
of a
Mm.
almost a pathologizing of the so-called oppressed or victim group. Um,
But the victimhood seems to be the dominant game at the moment.
yeah.
On again, I think on both sides that there is this kind of way in which who is the biggest victim uh, happens both inside wokeness and in opposition to populists and
Mhm.
inside of populism as well. I think that this kind of political motor of resentment
Mhm.
is a very foundational one to the condition of the world that we currently find ourselves in. That resentment is a massive motor for our current political frames.
Right.
Um, a guy, Peter Sloterdijk, a conservative philosopher, wrote a brilliant book. I think it's called Rage and Time, where he talks about this that these kind of resentment collectives spring up and can kind of push us towards revolution. But currently, the resentment is just kind of bouncing around. There isn't any kind of meaningful. Again, to go back to what I was saying at the beginning
Yes,
of the
yes.
show, I
Yeah.
don't think there's meaningful social change being really enacted by this resentment. I think it's more the resentment and the ideology are kind of working together. I mean, populism could produce a meaningful social change, but even then, I think it can easily be hijacked into, again, just reinforcing the neoliberal system that we find ourselves in.
Right. Maybe a way to conclude is to pose the question to you: where are we going from here? Are you hopeful that we'll find a way beyond these resentment cultures into an era of good faith dialogue and
Mhm.
common humanity, or are we doomed?
I think we will move toward populism, is
Okay.
my sense. I think there will be a backlash uh, that is not going to be purely it's not going to be purely the fault of the work, but you can already see it happening in Europe, in South America,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
probably in America.
Sure.
That I think we're going to probably go through a period of more populist governments. I don't understand, or I don't know what that will look like. I think England is a bit of an outlier, but I think it will
Uh,
breed a whole new set of
okay.
issues.
All
Mm.
right. So I think
Does that
this
answer
is,
the question?
yeah, it doesn't sound hopeful, particularly.
Well, I'm known for my pessimism and cynicism, so
I think that this is the terror and the nightmare of the left, that
um,
Donald Trump is going to become the president, and the right wing populists are going to come with their racism and their xenophobia,
um,
and the
um,
world is going to turn into hell.
um,
I hope not. And if populism has anything to contribute that's of value, I hope that that can happen. But if
yeah.
it's simply a reactionary movement, I don't think it's going to end well. It's just going to go back and forth. And so I
No,
don't know how
but
I would answer that question myself. I
could
like, yeah, go ahead.
I think there is a need for a genuine, principled conservatism to re-emerge in politics. I think populism has a kind of resentment motor and can be quite revolutionary and doesn't seem like always, those kind of principles,
Hmm.
transcendent principles, like, I don't know, a moral, the importance of kind of like a moral uprightness or virtuousness, uh, doesn't seem central to populism. If you can elect Donald Trump, for instance, he's
Right,
not like the most
right.
virtuous kind of person.
But so you distinguish that from a more reasoned conservatism.
Yeah, I would. I would. I
Yeah,
would
yeah.
say that that kind of almost more traditionalist conservatism has disappeared from our culture, and there, I think, is a need to bring at least some elements of it back to balance things out. Where that means, like I'm saying, an emphasis on more of a kind of virtue ethics or
Hmm.
something
Hmm.
along these
Hmm.
lines. I think that would be very helpful.
Not just virtue signaling. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, thanks for this conversation. This was quite rousing for me and gave me plenty to think about. And you didn't piss me off, but you gave me some things to think about. I
I've
appreciate it.
failed in my mission, then, Michael. We have to meet again.
We'll have to try this again and see if you can piss me off. All right. Well, thanks, Nick. Thanks a
No
lot.
worries. No
And
worries.
take care of yourself. And good luck with the completing your doctoral program. And I look forward to hearing more from you. I have a
Yeah,
feeling that you've got more to write and more to say.
definitely got a lot more to say. So,
Yeah. Okay. All
thanks very
right.
much, Michael.
You're welcome. Thank you. So
Take
long.
care. Bye
Bye
bye.
bye.